At 0317 hours on November 29, 1944, Commander Joseph Enright stood at the periscope of the American submarine USS Archerfish, running 200 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Through the narrow green lens, he stared at the largest warship he had ever seen. The target was enormous. It moved through the dark at nearly 18 knots, zigzagging to avoid attack just off the coast of Japan. Enright had been tracking the ship for more than 6 exhausting hours. His crew was worn out. Archerfish had completed 4 previous war patrols without sinking a single enemy ship. Now everything would come down to the next 90 seconds. If Enright was wrong, the submarine would almost certainly be destroyed. The massive ship ahead was escorted by 3 Japanese destroyers. Their wakes glowed faintly in the moonlight. Even through the haze of the periscope, Enright could see that the flight deck stretched far into the darkness. His torpedo data computer was steady and locked onto the target. The control room was silent. Every man waited. What Enright did not know was that the ship he was about to attack was Shinano, a 72,000-ton supercarrier. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built up to that time, and the largest warship afloat anywhere in the world. She had been commissioned only 10 days earlier. American intelligence didn't even know she existed. Shinano was on her maiden voyage, traveling from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal to the naval base at Kure for final fitting and testing. Within minutes, she would become the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine in the history of naval warfare. But the reason Japanese admirals feared American submarines did not begin with Shinano. It began 2 years earlier, when American torpedoes did not work. In the early months of the Pacific War, U.S. submarine captains were labeled cautious, even timid. Japanese merchant ships crossed the Pacific with little interference. Supplies flowed freely to Japan's factories and armies. Something was terribly wrong. The real problem was so basic and so deeply buried inside the U.S. Navy's system that it nearly cost America the war in the Pacific. It began with a weapon failure and with one officer who refused to accept the official excuses. On the morning of December 7, 1941, everything changed for the United States Pacific Fleet. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor without warning. Battleship Row was devastated. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. More than 2,000 Americans were killed in less than 2 hours. But the Japanese missed something critical. The submarine base at Pearl Harbor was left largely untouched. The massive fuel storage tanks that powered American operations across the Pacific survived, and 29 American submarines were ready for immediate action. Within hours of the attack, President Franklin Roosevelt approved a new policy: unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. American submarines would sink any enemy warship, merchant vessel, or transport found in Japanese-controlled waters without warning and without helping survivors. The goal was clear. The United States would do to Japan what German U-boats were trying to do to Britain. It would choke an island nation by cutting its sea lanes. It would starve factories of raw materials. It would sink the ships that fed Japan's war machine. At least, that was the plan. In reality, the first year of the American submarine campaign was a disaster. Throughout early 1942, American submarines attacked Japanese ships again and again. Torpedoes struck their targets, and nothing happened. No explosions, no fires, no sinking ships. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, captain of the submarine USS Seawolf, was one of the first officers to carefully document the problem. During 6 war patrols in the first year of the war, Warder recorded repeated cases where American Mark 14 torpedoes hit Japanese ships and simply failed. His patrol reports described the same thing over and over: a solid metallic thud heard through the hull, followed by silence. No detonation, no damage. The enemy ship continued on its way. Near Christmas Island, Seawolf encountered a Japanese invasion force anchored offshore. Warder maneuvered carefully into position and launched a spread of torpedoes at the light cruiser Naka from close range. One torpedo struck the target, the rest missed or failed. The hit torpedo did not explode. Naka escaped and later returned to port for repairs. Seawolf returned empty-handed. The same stories came from submarines across the Pacific. Captains executed perfect attack approaches. They fired at short range. They heard impacts. Then they watched helplessly as enemy ships sailed away unharmed. The frustration was intense. These crews risked their lives every patrol. They were doing their jobs correctly, and their weapons failed them. When captains complained, the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed them. Officials insisted the torpedoes were fine. Any failures, they claimed, must be caused by poor tactics, bad maintenance, or human error. The captains, they said, were simply not skilled enough. The Mark 14 torpedo had been designed by experts at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. It had passed official testing. Therefore, the weapon could not be the problem. But the submarine captains knew the truth. They were not missing. Their torpedoes were hitting. The sounds were unmistakable. Something was fundamentally wrong with the weapon itself. The proof became undeniable when submarines switched back to older Mark 10 torpedoes. With the same crews, same tactics, and same conditions, success rates immediately improved. The only thing that had changed was the torpedo. That evidence could not be ignored. The man who finally forced the Navy to confront the truth and turned American submarines into the most deadly weapon of the Pacific War was Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood. In February 1943, following the death of Rear Admiral Robert English in a plane crash, Lockwood became Commander Submarines Pacific, Co-Subpac. His sailors called him Uncle Charlie. Lockwood was 52 years old. He was a career submariner who had commanded his first submarine in 1914. He had spent nearly his entire adult life underwater. He understood the boats, he understood the men, and he understood combat. Most importantly, Lockwood trusted his captains. When dozens of experienced officers reported the same failures, Lockwood knew the problem was not poor seamanship. He believed his crews, and he set out to prove they were right. The Mark 14 torpedo had entered service in 1938. On paper, it was impressive. 20 feet long, weighing over 3,000 pounds, carrying a 500-pound Torpex warhead. It could run at high speed or long range and was meant to be the most powerful submarine weapon ever built. It used 2 detonators. The first was a secret Mark 6 magnetic exploder, designed to sense a ship's magnetic field and detonate beneath the keel, breaking the ship in half. The second was a contact exploder, meant to trigger on impact. Both systems were advanced, both were classified, and both had been live tested only twice before being issued to the fleet. The NA's obsession with secrecy, combined with budget limits during the Great Depression, meant proper testing was never done. No full-scale combat trials, no realistic exercises. American submariners were sent to war with a weapon that had never truly been proven. And they paid the price in blood and failure, until Lockwood forced the truth into the open.
And so the United States went to war with a torpedo that no one had ever truly proven would work reliably in combat. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood began investigating the problem even before he arrived at Pearl Harbor. While serving as commander of submarines in the Southwest Pacific, based in Australia, he heard the same complaints from his captains that were being reported throughout the submarine force. Torpedoes were missing when they should hit. Others struck targets and failed to explode. Lockwood decided to test the weapon himself. He ordered torpedoes fired into fishing nets so their running depth could be measured accurately. According to official specifications, the Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to run at whatever depth the captain set. If a captain set the depth at 10 feet, the torpedo should travel 10 feet below the surface. This was critical. The Mark 6 magnetic exploder only worked if the torpedo passed beneath the ship's hull at exactly the right depth. If the torpedo ran too deep, it would pass harmlessly under the target without detonating. The test results were shocking. The torpedoes were running 11 feet deeper than their settings. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet was actually running at 21 feet. This meant that many torpedoes were passing completely under Japanese ships, never close enough to trigger either the magnetic exploder or the contact exploder. Lockwood sent his findings to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. The Bureau rejected them. Officials claimed their own tests at Newport showed the torpedoes worked correctly. They argued that fleet crews must be setting depths incorrectly or using improper calibration procedures. They refused to believe the weapon itself was defective. Lockwood did not back down. He repeated the tests. The results were the same. He gathered detailed measurements, compiled formal reports, and pushed them up the chain of command again and again. Finally, in August 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the Bureau of Ordnance conducted its own tests and was forced to admit the truth. The Mark 14 torpedo was indeed running about 10 feet deeper than designed. The cause was embarrassingly simple. During development, the torpedo had been tested using practice warheads that were much lighter than the real combat warheads. When the heavier explosive warhead was installed, it changed the balance of the torpedo, causing it to sink lower in the water. On top of that, the hydrostatic depth sensor was poorly placed, giving false readings, especially at high speeds. Corrections were made. Captains were told to adjust their depth settings to compensate. The Navy believed the problem had been fixed. It had not. Even with corrected depth settings, torpedoes continued to fail. Some exploded far short of their targets. Others hit ships squarely and did nothing. The magnetic exploder was unreliable. The contact exploder was unreliable. The entire system was deeply flawed. On April 9, 1943, Lieutenant Commander John Scott aboard the submarine USS Tunney found himself in a perfect attack position against Japanese aircraft carriers, including Taiho and Unyo. From a range of just 880 yards, he fired all 10 torpedo tubes. Through the hull, the crew heard explosions, 4 from the stern shots and 3 from the bow. Yet none of the carriers slowed. None showed signs of damage. Later intelligence revealed the truth. All 7 explosions had been premature detonations. The torpedoes had exploded hundreds of yards short of their targets. The magnetic exploders had triggered too early. Every torpedo had failed. The next day, The submarine Pompon attacked the carrier Shokaku with 6 torpedoes. At least 3 detonated prematurely. The carrier escaped unharmed. Submarine captains estimated that nearly 10% of their torpedoes exploded early. The Bureau of Ordnance claimed the number was only 2%. Even the lower figure was unacceptable. These men were risking their lives with weapons that worked less than half the time. Ships that should have been sunk escaped to fight again. Japanese troops that should have drowned were landing safely on Pacific Islands. The war dragged on longer than it needed to. In the summer of 1943, Lockwood flew to Washington to confront the Bureau of Ordnance directly. At a meeting with senior admirals, he made his anger unmistakably clear. If the Bureau of Ordnance could not provide torpedoes that would hit and explode, he said, then for God's sakes they should ask the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook so submarines could rip the steel plates off enemy hulls. The head of the Bureau, Rear Admiral William Blandy, was furious. He accused Lockwood of trying to discredit his organization. He demanded to know whether attacking the Bureau of Ordnance was part of Lockwood's mission. Lockwood calmly replied that if anything he said got the Bureau moving and produced real action, then the trip had been worth it. By June 1943, Lockwood had lost patience. He officially ordered what many captains were already doing quietly on their own: disable the magnetic exploder completely. From now on, torpedoes would rely only on contact detonation. The magnetic system could not be trusted. Even then, the failures continued. The final breakthrough came in July 1943 aboard the submarine USS Tenosa. Commander Dan Daspit encountered a massive 19,000-ton Japanese whale factory ship, Tonan Maru 3. The ship was stopped in the water and unescorted, a perfect target. Daspit fired 4 torpedoes from 4,000 yards. 2 hit and brought the ship to a halt. He fired 2 more. Both hit. The target was now motionless. Daspit maneuvered into an ideal firing position, just 880 yards off the ship's beam. The range was perfect. The angle was perfect. Missing was impossible. He fired 9 more torpedoes. All 9 hit the target. None exploded. Through the periscope, Daspit watched torpedo after torpedo strike the motionless ship and fail. Some produced small bursts when their air flasks ruptured on impact. None detonated their warheads. The Japanese ship remained afloat. Convinced the problem went deeper than chance, Daspit made a critical decision. He saved his final torpedo and brought it back to Pearl Harbor for examination. What investigators discovered was devastating. The contact exploder's firing pin was too weak. When a torpedo struck a ship head-on, the force of impact caused the firing pin to bend or collapse before it could trigger the detonator. Ironically, the more accurate the shot, the more likely the torpedo would fail. A perfect hit was often a guaranteed dud. The Navy's primary submarine weapon had been poorly tested, badly designed, and rushed into service without proper understanding of its flaws. 3 separate defects, depth control, magnetic detonation, and contact detonation, had crippled American submarine operations for nearly 2 years. The machine shops at Pearl Harbor went to work immediately. Engineers designed a stronger firing pin using improved materials. According to legend, they studied metal from the propeller blades of downed Japanese aircraft and found it ideal for the job. By late September 1943, the submarine Barb sailed on patrol carrying torpedoes with the redesigned exploder. By mid-October, every submarine leaving Pearl Harbor carried the modified weapons. Uncle Charlie had won. After 21 months of frustration, wasted attacks, and unnecessary deaths, the American submarine force finally had torpedoes that worked. And when they did, the change was immediate. American submarines became the most deadly naval weapon in the Pacific War. The transformation was sudden, overwhelming, and devastating.
In 1942, American submarines sank about 109 Japanese ships, totaling roughly 42,000 tons. For the amount of effort, money, and risk involved, the results were deeply disappointing. Too many patrols returned without sinking anything. Too many enemy ships escaped unharmed. Too many chances were wasted because torpedoes failed when they should have worked. In 1943, as torpedo problems slowly began to be fixed, the numbers improved. Sinkings increased. Confidence grew. But the real destruction came in 1944. That year alone, American submarines sank 63 Japanese merchant ships, totaling about 2.7 million tons of shipping. This was more tonnage than had been sunk during the first 25 months of the war combined. The Japanese merchant fleet was no longer just suffering losses, it was being systematically destroyed. But Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood understood that sinking random cargo ships was not enough. If American submarines were going to end the war faster, they needed to sink the ships that mattered most. In late 1943, Lockwood issued new orders. From that point forward, oil tankers were the highest priority target for every submarine patrol. Japan had gone to war because of oil. The American oil embargo of July 1941 had left Japan with roughly 12 months of fuel for the Army and 18 months for the Navy. Japan's entire war plan depended on capturing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and shipping that oil back to the home islands. That oil was needed to run factories, fuel warships, and power aircraft. Without it, Japan could not fight. The distance from the oil fields of Southeast Asia to Japan was about 6,000 kilometers. Every barrel of oil, every gallon of aviation fuel and diesel had to travel by ship. There were no pipelines, no railways, no land routes. The sea was the only path. The tanker convoys were Japan's lifeline. Lockwood intended to cut it. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese merchant shipping codes. Intelligence officers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific could track tanker movements across the ocean. They knew which ships were sailing, what cargo they carried, which routes they followed, and when they were expected to arrive. Lockwood used this information to position his submarines with deadly precision. They waited along shipping lanes. They hid at narrow choke points where tankers had no choice but to pass. They patrolled waters near Singapore and the Philippines. They prowled the approaches to the Japanese home islands. And when the tankers came, the submarines attacked. The results were disastrous for Japan. Of the 43 Japanese tankers lost in the first 6 months of 1944, 27 were sunk by American submarines. Japanese leaders responded with desperation. Steel meant for building warships was redirected to tanker construction. This was an extraordinary and costly decision. Japan needed every ton of steel for its shrinking navy, but without oil, even the ships already built were useless. Warships without fuel could not sail. Aircraft without gasoline could not fly. Even with every effort focused on building new tankers, Japan could not keep up. Submarines were sinking ships faster than shipyards could replace them. By the end of 1944, American submarines had destroyed 2/3 of Japan's tanker fleet. Japanese oil imports from the Southern Resource Zone peaked at about 1.4 million barrels a month, while oil production in Japanese-controlled areas reached nearly 4 million barrels a month in 1943. Most of that oil never reached Japan. American submarines made sure of that. The effects spread through every part of Japan's military. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's carrier fleet, returned from Rabaul in late 1943 to rebuild his air groups and train new pilots. What he found was alarming. The fuel shortage was so severe that he could not operate his fleet near Japan. There simply was not enough fuel for training. Ozawa was forced to move his entire carrier fleet to Singapore, closer to the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra. From there, his ships could refuel locally instead of relying on dangerous tanker convoys. But this move came at a terrible cost. Singapore was thousands of miles away from the main battle area in the Central Pacific. When American forces advanced into the Mariana Islands, Ozawa's fleet would have to sail a long distance to respond. His pilots would have little training time. His ships would arrive only with the minimum fuel needed for battle. The consequences became clear in June 1944. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American forces landed on Saipan, threatening Japan's inner defensive line. Ozawa's fleet sailed from Singapore to challenge the invasion. Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft against the American fleet, but the pilots were poorly trained. Many had fewer than 100 flight hours. They had trained over calm waters near Singapore. They had never faced heavy anti-aircraft fire. They had never fought experienced American pilots flying the new F-6 Hellcat. The result was devastating. American fighters shot down Japanese aircraft before they could reach their targets. Dive bombers and torpedo planes fell from the sky in large numbers. The battle quickly turned into a massacre. It became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japan lost about 270 aircraft. By the end of the battle, nearly 500 Japanese planes and most of Japan's remaining experienced naval pilots were gone. American submarines added to the disaster. The submarine USS Albacore torpedoed and sank the fleet carrier Taiho. The submarine USS Kavala sank the fleet carrier Shokaku. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. And still, the submarines continued sinking tankers. By early 1945, the situation was hopeless. Oil imports slowed to almost nothing. Warships remained tied to their piers, unable to sail. Aircraft sat on airfields because there was no fuel to fly them. The last tanker from Southeast Asia reached Japan in March 1945. After that, nothing. The pipeline was closed. Japan's lifeline had been cut. But American submarines did more than destroy oil supplies. They also crippled Japan's ability to reinforce its island garrisons. During the war, American submarines sank an estimated 44,000 Japanese troop transports. In 33 of those sinkings, more than 1,000 soldiers died. Entire units vanished beneath the sea before ever reaching the battlefield. Troop ships sailed from Japan packed with soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Each ship was urgently needed. Each had to pass through waters hunted by American submarines. At Guadalcanal, Saipan, and later battles, thousands of Japanese troops were killed in transit or never arrived at all. Reinforcements that Japanese commanders counted on simply did not exist. Garrisons that should have been strengthened remained weak. Counterattacks that should have overwhelmed American forces never happened.
In January 1945, Japanese planners issued a grim document titled How to Deal with Maritime Emergencies. It admitted that troop transports were dangerously overcrowded. Soldiers were packed into cargo holds on stacked bunks called silkworm shelves. These ships were floating death traps. When submarines found them, casualties were enormous. Some historians estimate that American submarines killed more than 97,000 Japanese soldiers at sea. It was destruction carried out silently beneath the waves, but it reshaped the war in the Pacific.
This number comes from careful study of Japanese records compiled after the war. Even the historians who produced these figures admit that they represent a minimum, not a final total. Japanese records did not consistently track troop losses from ships sunk by submarines. Many sinkings were never fully recorded. Many casualty reports were lost or destroyed during the war. The real number of soldiers killed at sea may have been far higher. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders was severe. Admiral Mainichi Koga, who replaced Isoroku Yamamoto as commander of the combined fleet, understood the danger clearly. Every convoy sailing from Japan to the southern resource zone faced submarine attack. Every tanker bound for Singapore risked being sunk. Every troop transport sent to reinforce the Philippines might never arrive. Japanese naval leaders had built their careers around one idea: the decisive fleet battle. They studied the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet. They believed modern war would be decided the same way, by battleships and carriers meeting in massive, dramatic engagements. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see. American submarines operated beneath the surface. They attacked without warning. They vanished before escorts could respond. They were invisible, unpredictable, and everywhere at once. And after the Mark 14 torpedo was fixed, they almost never missed. Japan tried desperately to fight back. They formed escort groups modeled after British anti-submarine forces. They introduced convoy systems. They deployed aircraft to patrol shipping lanes. They increased depth charge production. They developed radar and improved sonar systems. But Japan faced a problem it could not solve. It did not have the industrial capacity to build enough escort ships. Japan had focused its naval strategy on battleships and aircraft carriers. It had neglected the smaller escort vessels that protected merchant shipping. During the war, Japan commissioned roughly 250 destroyers and escort ships. By comparison, American submarines lost only 52 boats to all causes during the entire conflict. Japanese anti-submarine tactics did improve, especially after radar became more common in late 1943. American submarine crews reported that patrols in 1944 were more dangerous than earlier ones. Depth charge attacks became more accurate. Japanese escorts learned how to anticipate submarine movements. The hunt grew harder. Even so, the cost to the United States was high. 52 American submarines were lost, along with more than 3,500 men. The casualty rate, about 22%, was the highest of any branch of the U.S. military. Submarine service was extraordinarily dangerous. The boats that failed to return simply vanished. They were lost with all hands, their crews sealed forever inside steel hulls on the ocean floor. Yet the numbers still favored the Americans. For every U.S. submarine lost, Japan lost dozens of merchant ships and thousands of soldiers. The math was relentless. Beneath the waves, Japan was losing the war. This brings us back to Commander Joseph Enright and the Shinano. Enright had served in submarines since before the war. He had watched skilled captains struggle in 1942 as defective torpedoes ruined attacks. He had seen patrols fail through no fault of the crews involved. He understood the frustration of making a perfect approach only to watch weapons fail. Early in the war, Enright had commanded the submarine USS Dace and completed a disappointing patrol. Later, he took command of USS Archerfish. 4 patrols produced no confirmed sinkings. In a force that prized aggressive results, his record appeared average at best. But by November 1944, everything had changed. The torpedoes worked. Intelligence was accurate. Submarine tactics had been refined by 3 years of combat. And Enright was about to encounter the opportunity of a lifetime. Archerfish was on her 5th war patrol, operating off the coast of Japan. Her primary assignment was to rescue B-29 bomber crews shot down during raids on the Japanese home islands. On the evening of November 28th, poor weather canceled bombing missions. Archerfish was free to hunt. At 20:48 hours, radar operators detected a large contact leaving Tokyo Bay. The target was moving fast, at least 18 knots, and was escorted by 3 smaller vessels. Archerfish ordered pursuit. For 6 hours, Archerfish tracked the mystery ship on the surface, running a parallel course and waiting for the right moment. The target zigzagged constantly, a standard anti-submarine tactic designed to throw off attackers. But Captain Toshio Abe, commanding the ship, made a critical mistake. He believed he was being tracked by multiple submarines, not just one. He assumed Archerfish was acting as a decoy while other submarines moved into attack positions. Because of this, he kept his destroyers close instead of ordering them to chase the contact. Even more importantly, Abe continued zigzagging instead of running straight at maximum speed. A straight course might have allowed the ship to outrun Archerfish. Instead, every zigzag brought the target closer. At 2:56 hours, Archerfish submerged and turned east to move into the best firing position. Enright ordered his torpedoes set to 10 feet. He wanted the hits high on the hull, where damage control would be hardest. He also hoped to compensate in case the torpedoes ran deeper than expected, an echo of the problems Lockwood had fought to fix. At 3:17 hours, the target turned south as part of its zigzag pattern. This placed the ship's entire broadside perfectly perpendicular to Archerfish. The range was 1,400 yards. The angle was perfect. Enright could not have asked for a better setup. He fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck the ship between the anti-torpedo bulge and the waterline. The explosions were massive, shaking Archerfish from bow to stern. The submarine immediately dove to 400 feet to escape the expected depth charge attack. For the next 47 minutes, the crew heard loud breaking and tearing noises from above. The ship they had struck was Shinano. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built up to that time. Shinano had been laid down in May 1940 as the 3rd Yamato-class battleship, sister ship to Yamato and Musashi, the most powerful battleships ever constructed. After Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway in June 1942, the Navy ordered Shinano converted into an aircraft carrier. Her construction was so secret that American intelligence did not know she existed. B-29 reconnaissance aircraft photographed her during sea trials on November 1st, but analysts failed to identify what they were seeing. To the Americans, Shinano was unknown until after the war. She displaced 72,000 tons. Her armored flight deck was designed to survive 1,000-pound bomb hits. She was intended to operate as a support carrier, carrying fuel, ammunition, and replacement aircraft for other carriers. Japan had placed enormous hopes on her. She sank in less than 7 hours. Flooding spread uncontrollably. Watertight doors were unfinished. Pumps were missing from key compartments. Many sections were not properly sealed. Shinano had been rushed to completion, and quality suffered. Her crew was inexperienced. Many sailors had never served aboard an aircraft carrier. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine slipped beneath the waves, undone not just by torpedoes, but by haste, secrecy, and a war already lost beneath the sea.
The crew of Shinano did not know their ship well. They were unfamiliar with her internal layout. They did not fully understand her damage control systems. When the torpedoes struck, they reacted slowly and without coordination. The 4 torpedo hits revealed a serious design flaw where Shinano's armor belt connected to her underwater protection system. This weakness existed in all Yamato-class ships. Water poured through the damaged sections faster than the pumps could remove it. Flooding spread rapidly from compartment to compartment. Captain Toshio Abe attempted to save his ship. He ordered Shinano turned toward the Japanese coast in an effort to beach her. He also ordered the flooding of portside tanks to counter the growing list to starboard. But the damage was too severe. The water could not be contained. At 10:18 a.m., Captain Abe ordered the crew to abandon ship. 45 minutes later, Shinano rolled completely over and sank stern first beneath the waves. Captain Abe chose to go down with his ship. He was later promoted posthumously to Rear Admiral. 1,435 men died with him. About 1,000 crew members and civilian workers were rescued. The submarine USS Archerfish returned to Guam on December 15, 1944. In a single attack, she had sunk more tonnage than any submarine in history. Yet Commander Joseph Enright did not know exactly what he had sunk. During his patrol report, Enright sketched the ship from memory. Based on its size and features, he estimated the target displaced about 28,000 tons, similar to a Hayatake-class carrier. American intelligence first credited Archerfish with sinking a cruiser, then later upgraded the claim to an aircraft carrier based on Enright's drawings. Only after the war, when American investigators examined Japanese naval records, did the truth emerge. Archerfish had sunk Shinano, the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. Enright received the Navy Cross. Archerfish was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. The record still stands. But Shinano was only the most dramatic example of what American submarines accomplished. On November 21, 1944, the Japanese battleship Kongo, one of the Imperial Navy's oldest and most famous capital ships, was sunk by the submarine USS Sea Lion. Kongo was returning to Japan after the Battle of Leyte Gulf when Sea Lion caught her in the Formosa Strait. 2 torpedo hits detonated her magazines. She sank with the loss of more than 200 men. No Japanese battleship had ever been sunk by a submarine before. The psychological impact was enormous.
These were the great ships of the Imperial Navy, the pride of the fleet. Japanese admirals had trained their entire careers to command them, and now they were being destroyed by submarines that displaced less than 3% of their tonnage. During the war, American submarines sank 8 Japanese aircraft carriers, including Shinano. They destroyed fleet carriers Shokaku, Taiho, and Unryu, as well as escort carriers Taiyo, Unyo, and Shinyo. Each loss meant not only the ship itself, but also the trained pilots and aircraft aboard. They sank 2 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, dozens of destroyers and escorts, and thousands of transports, tankers, and cargo ships. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had fought relentlessly for reliable torpedoes and aggressive tactics while others urged caution, watched his submarine force achieve results beyond anything he had imagined. Under his command, American submarines sank more than 1,000 enemy ships, totaling over 5 million tons. His force accounted for roughly 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. The men who served under Uncle Charlie never forgot what he did for them. He believed his captains when the Bureau of Ordnance said they were wrong. He fought for weapons that worked. He pushed tactics that placed submarines in the most dangerous waters. And when his sailors returned from patrol, he made sure they were cared for. Lockwood established rest camps for returning crews. He arranged for submarines to be greeted with ice cream and fresh vegetables after patrol. He secured the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Waikiki as a rest facility for submariners. These may seem like small things, but to men who had spent weeks in cramped steel tubes beneath the sea, they meant everything. By early 1945, Japan's oil supply had collapsed completely. The tanker routes that once sustained the empire had become killing zones patrolled by American submarines. Japan's fuel shortage grew so severe that the government mobilized civilians to produce substitutes. Millions of people were ordered to dig up pine roots to be distilled into crude oil. More than 37,000 improvised distillation units were built across the country. They produced about 70,000 barrels of pine oil, from which only 3,000 barrels of aviation fuel could be refined. Even that fuel was contaminated with impurities. American jeeps that later used captured stocks during the occupation quickly suffered engine failures. The fuel clogged injectors and corroded engine parts. It barely worked at all. But Japan had no alternative. By August 1945, most Japanese warships had been sunk or immobilized by lack of fuel. The operational fleet was reduced to perhaps 20 destroyers and 40 submarines, many of which could remain at sea for only a few days. The admirals who had planned decisive fleet battles in the tradition of Tsushima now commanded ships that could not leave port. Surviving carriers could not launch aircraft because there was no aviation gasoline. Battleships sat idle with empty fuel tanks. American submarines achieved what no surface fleet or air force could have done alone. They severed Japan's supply lines. They starved the empire of resources. They killed soldiers before they reached the battlefield. They sank carriers before aircraft could take off. They destroyed tankers before fuel could be delivered. But this victory came at a terrible cost. Almost 1 in 5 American submarines that went to war was lost. One of the most famous was Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, captain of the submarine USS Wahoo. His aggressive tactics inspired a generation of submariners. He took Wahoo into waters others avoided. He attacked convoys relentlessly.
In 5 patrols, Wahoo sank 19 ships, totaling about 55,000 tons. On October 11, 1933, Wahoo was lost with all hands in the Sea of Japan, destroyed by Japanese aircraft while attempting to exit through the La Perouse Strait. Morton and all 79 crew members were killed. His body was never recovered. Morton's executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, went on to command the submarine USS Tang. O'Kane became the most successful American submarine commander of the war, sinking 33 ships in 5 patrols. Tang destroyed more enemy ships than any U.S. submarine. On October 24, 1944, during a night surface attack in the Formosa Strait, Tang fired her final torpedo at a damaged transport. The torpedo malfunctioned, ran in a circle, and struck Tang's stern. The submarine sank in 180 feet of water. 78 men were killed. O'Kane and 8 others survived, escaping through the flooded submarine using Mumsen lungs. They were captured and spent the final 10 months of the war as prisoners. After liberation, Richard O'Kane received the Medal of Honor. His citation noted that during Tang's final patrol, he sank 2 convoys totaling 13 ships in less than 24 hours. It was a silent war, fought beneath the waves, and it changed history.
Lockwood survived the war and continued to fight for his sailors. He worked to make sure their achievements were recorded and remembered. He wrote several books that later became classics of submarine history. He testified at war crimes trials and served as Inspector General of the U.S. Navy after the war. Above all, he pushed to ensure that the submarine force received the recognition it had earned. The official statistics tell the story clearly. American submarines made up less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel, yet they were responsible for more than 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. They sank over 1,100 merchant ships and more than 200 warships. They killed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors. They also rescued over 500 downed American airmen from the Pacific. Their impact changed the outcome of the war. Japanese admirals who began the conflict confident in their powerful battle fleet ended it with no ships, no fuel, and no hope. The submarines they had dismissed as secondary weapons, useful only for scouting or coastal defense, became the decisive force that crushed their empire. The underwater boats Japan failed to stop had strangled its supply lines and starved its war effort. That transformation began with one officer who refused to accept failure as normal. Charles Lockwood would not accept claims that faulty torpedoes were working when they clearly were not. He fought his own bureaucracy as fiercely as he fought the enemy. He demanded live-fire tests when the Bureau of Ordnance insisted they were unnecessary. He authorized weapon modifications even when regulations forbade unauthorized changes. He pushed aggressive tactics when official doctrine called for caution. And when the torpedoes finally worked, when submarines finally had weapons they could trust, they became unstoppable. Japanese admirals learned to fear what they could not see. Tankers vanished. Troop transports disappeared. Carriers sank without warning. American submarines operated deep inside Japanese-controlled waters, along vital shipping lanes, even inside the Sea of Japan itself. They could not be countered. They could not be stopped.
By the summer of 1945, the submarine campaign had reached its ultimate goal. Japan was isolated. Japan was starving. Japan was beaten. The war beneath the waves was over. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. Every story matters. Every story deserves to be remembered. We would also love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to history enthusiasts everywhere. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. There is a postscript to this story that deserves to be told. In the decades after the war, historians and researchers pieced together the full scope of what American submarines had achieved. Wartime records compiled by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee revealed that American submarines sank approximately 540,000 tons of Japanese warships and nearly 4.8 million tons of merchant shipping. Combined, this represented more than 54% of all Japanese naval losses during the war. But the numbers alone do not tell the full story. The submarines did not merely sink ships, they broke the backbone of an empire. They proved that an island nation dependent on sea transport could be forced into defeat by a relatively small force of underwater vessels. They demonstrated that modern submarines, when properly equipped and aggressively led, could change the strategic balance of an entire war. 10th grade standard, reading level. Military planners took notice. In the decades after 1945, submarine warfare became central to the naval strategies of every major power. Nuclear submarines inherited the legacy of the fleet boats that hunted across the Pacific. The tactics evolved, the weapons became more advanced, but the basic lesson remained the same. Control the seas below the surface, and you control the seas. Charles Lockwood retired from the Navy in 1947 with the rank of Vice Admiral. He spent his remaining years writing about the submarine force he had commanded. His books, including Sink 'em All and Down to the Sea in Subs, preserved the stories of the men who served under him. He died in 1967 at the age of 77 and is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, alongside Admirals Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and Richmond Kelly Turner. In 1970, a destroyer escort named USS Lockwood was commissioned in his honor. The Naval Submarine League continues to award the Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood Award each year to recognize excellence in submarine operations. Richard O'Kane later retired as a Rear Admiral. He wrote 2 books about his wartime experiences, Wahoo and Clear the Bridge, both considered classics of submarine literature. He died in 1994 at the age of 83. The guided missile destroyer USS O'Kane, commissioned in 1999, carries his name. The wreck of USS Wahoo was discovered in 2006 in the La Perouse Strait, resting in over 200 feet of water. Dudley Morton and his 79 crewmen remain entombed within their submarine, a war grave respected by the nations that once fought over those seas. The Shinano lies somewhere in the deep waters off the coast of Japan, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a silent monument to the destructive power of the American undersea campaign. And scattered across thousands of miles of ocean floor are the submarines that never returned home. Their crews made the ultimate sacrifice in the silent service. They deserve to be remembered. This is how a small force of submarines changed the course of a world war. Not through one decisive battle, but through relentless pressure. Not through dramatic fleet engagements, but through patient hunting and precise strikes. Not through overwhelming numbers, but through skill, courage, and weapons that finally worked. Japanese admirals learned to fear what they could not see. Japanese admirals learned their mistake too late. By the time they understood the threat, their tankers were sunk, their armies were stranded, and their empire was dying of starvation beneath the waves.